people worry so much about power instead of just simplifying it and worrying about impulse when they're trying to design their training and to design their impact on their athletes?
The thing that is misleading for people from the outside is that the unusual exercises are the ones that get the attention. Like Bondarchuk's throwers, you'll see them throwing this, that, or the other, but if you think that they're not squatting as well, you're crazy.
You've got a football player here, a combat athlete, like a wrestler here, and you got a triple jumper here. Would you set up a training system that would have it eccentric focus or concentric focus days?
I would think about the dynamic correspondence of what I'm doing in my training to how they're exerting force in the sporting environment. When you actually get down to programming it, it's force production. So like it still relies on a base of general strength. So there's probably going to be things in the program at certain times of the year for both those athletes that are very similar.
How are you looking at those athletes? How does that influence what you think that they should be doing in their training in the gym and then their training outside the gym?
Wow. Yeah. Let's start with a big one.
We're going to go over the best ways that you can exert force and become more explosive, and we're going to start right now. I was fortunate enough to sit down with Dr. Dan Cleather, who's worked in the realm of sports performance. He is a professor and a researcher that also happens to be a coach. During the podcast, Dan and I get into different concepts around impulse, around being explosive, what the difference is between force, output, and time versus power. These are all high-end concepts, but fortunately, throughout the podcast, we talk about these high-end mechanical concepts and then link them into high-end training and programming. So this thing is absolutely stocked with content. I've been reading his books over the last 5 to 6 years. I'm telling you right now, get his books, sit down, listen to the podcast, take as many notes as possible, ask yourself more questions, because this is a podcast that's going to take your knowledge to the next level. Now, let's get started. The first question I have is I've listened to your any podcast that you've done. It's not a lot, but I've found them all. And then I've read your books. I haven't read the new one yet, but some of the most important things that I hear as a strength coach is one, understanding how athletes exert force and understanding sort of the concepts around impulse, but then also understanding constraints within sports. And I guess the first thing that I wanted to do was ask you, like, if you're looking at athletes as a strength and conditioning coach, let's say, and you've got a football player here, and you got a combat athlete, like a wrestler here, and you got a triple jumper here, how are you looking at those athletes in determining their ways that they apply force, and then what those, I guess also the constraints and what that does to the force application, and then how does that influence what you think that they should be doing in their training in the gym and then their training outside the gym?
Wow. Yeah. Start with a big one. I think that's my answer to that question is that's kind of coaching. Like it's like you've got an individual in front of you, and you use all the tools that you have to kind of work out what they're good at and what they need. And part of that is looking at how they move. Part of that is thinking about, okay, what causes the way that they move? So like how are they good at expressing force? Are there any ways in which they're not good at expressing force? And kind of like taking it from there, I think. Clearly kind of, the nature of the sport that athlete is involved in is going to change what you're going to do with them. But kind of that's going to mold, the athlete that you have in front of you. So the athlete you have in front of you will have, probably be already quite well determined by the sport that they've been doing for how long they've been doing it. And clearly, there needs to be some understanding of the sport itself. But yeah, like I I don't think I have a model or a system by which I would kind of say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. It's more kind of like, okay, well, let's go in the gym and see how you move and see what you can do. And I'm sure we'll find something that's, interesting to play with.
So I guess off of that then is like, and I want to use like thinking American football as a defensive lineman, let's say, and I like to use this example. And I have a very close friend who coached the Olympic champ in the triple jump. And if I see offensive or defensive linemen, it might take like a half second for them to make contact. And it reminds me, you've used this example in the past in force, where you talk about an athlete putting force into the ground on sand, and what their counter movement might look like versus somebody who's doing a jump on a hard surface. And it makes me sort of think this way with football and somebody applying force into grass or turf versus a triple jumper who's running full speed. How do you running full speed and then they have crazy amounts of force, relative to their body weight when they're grounding? How do you differentiate? And maybe this is where we could lead into the impulse, is like, how do you differentiate training in the sense of this athlete needs maybe a little bit, they're not applying force as fast as the triple jumper, at least in from my layman perspective. And then I try to think through, okay, how would I do that in the gym? And I guess that's where I wanted to keep picking your brain and lead into like the understanding of impulse, but then the time constraint is very different. And then I wanted to see how you might compartmentalize that triple jumper versus that, defensive lineman or offensive lineman, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Like that's a really, like that example is really interesting, because like as we know, we want to be able to generate and express huge amounts of force, but what those two athletes are doing in terms of the way that they're expressing force will be very, very different. So kind of like if you think about the triple jumper when they're running, like they have they're very constrained in how they how much time they have to exert force, and they're going to be super, super bouncy, so they're relying on elasticity. They don't have huge changes in joint excursion. As they're exerting force, they're bouncing along the track. Equally, when they get to the point where they take off, they're still going to be relying a lot on elasticity, but they're going to be generating force using the momentum that they're taking into the board. So kind of they've already got momentum, and they can use that to kind of as a vehicle to produce high forces when they actually start jumping. Whereas the lineman has none of that. They're starting from a position where they don't have any momentum at all, so they have to generate all of that force themselves. They're starting from zero. They're going to be starting from a much more flex position, so they're going to be producing force through larger joint ranges of motion, and they're not. Their first step or two is they're going to have a load more time to exert force, and so that force production is much, much more concentric dominant, and is much more going to be about the abilities of the muscle tissue itself to be able to generate high forces, than it is in the triple jumper, where it's about recycling the forces that you're experiencing and bouncing down the track. So kind of like that example is super interesting, because although the goal is high force, the means by which that force is produced is very, very different.
Okay, so you're sort of saying that when you look at somebody like a triple jumper, they're going to have there's more of an eccentric component, I guess, in the sense that especially when they're grounding and they're going through like the hop, the step, right? And you're looking at it and you're going, okay, and that contributes. Whereas somebody like a football player, they're starting at a almost deeper than 90-degree position. If they're a defensive lineman, it's going to be all concentric, and it's going to be this longer time frame that they're putting that force into the ground. Well, first, is that sort of accurate what you're saying?
Yeah, like I would say that, you know, like the linemen as they start, they're pushing, you know, whereas the triple jumper is bouncing.
So do you, when you're training, then do you set up as a coach, if you're coaching someone in this case, let's say theoretically or hypothetically, in this case, would you set up a training system that would have it like eccentric focus or concentric focus days, or would that be a different way? Like, how would you set up your training then?
I mean, I would always kind of, you know, like in this case, you know, I would come back to kind of first principles. So like I would think about the dynamic correspondence of, you know, what I'm doing in my training to how they're exerting force in the sporting environment. And so kind of like we've done that analysis in the last 5 minutes a little bit already. So, you know, we've said, you know, okay, force production in triple jumping is going to be, you know, small joint excursions, especially when let's just talk about the running phase of, you know, not the jumping phase, but like, you know, if you take just the running phase, you've got, you know, high forces, but in very short time periods with small joint excursions, which are, you know, really, really elastic, you know, whereas the start of the lineman is larger joint excursions, you know, and, you know, very, very, pushy, like, you know, like it's about, you know, the force that's actually being produced in, you know, like, I mean, the force is being produced in the muscle when you bounce as well, but kind of like, you know, like there's not something that you're relying on to help you produce the force. So kind of, yeah, like the challenge, you know, the challenge for the athlete, or the way that the athlete is producing forces in those two different environments is very, very different, you know, and so kind of, you know, the training, you know, should very much reflect, you know, the very large differences in how those athletes are producing force in the environment. Like when you actually get down to programming it, you know, like, you know, you're still going to have, you know, general and specific things. So kind of like, you know, like it's force production. So like it still, you know, relies on a base of general strength. So, you know, there's probably going to be things, you know, in the program at certain times of the year for both those athletes that are very similar. But the sort of specific prep of those athletes is probably, you know, very different, because the way that they, you know, are producing force in the competitive environment is so different.
Right. Okay. You mentioned dynamic correspondence. Can you sort of go into, in dynamic correspondence, like the principles around that, or the theory around that, and what that would sort of mean for somebody who might have, like, maybe you use the principles of dynamic correspondence as like a checkpoint? What would someone be, you know, if somebody listening, they've never heard this term, what would that entail?
Yeah. Thank you. Like, yeah. So, I mean, like dynamic correspondence, like it, you know, comes out of kind of Russian training literature. But it's essentially kind of recognizing the fact that, okay, you know, in sporting performance, like, you know, what's probably going to be the most important variable always, or in the vast majority of cases, it is, you know, the way that we produce force. So kind of like, if we want to make someone better in the competitive environment, then, you know, we need to be training in a way such that we improve their capacity to express force, but more than that we improve their capacity to express force in the sporting environment. You know, so as we've seen in the example that you gave me, like, you know, the way that force is expressed in the sporting environment can be very, very different. And so kind of what dynamic correspondence gives us is, yeah, like it's a checklist of boxes of different things, different facets of how force expressed, which we can look at, and we can think about, okay, how does that apply in the sporting skill? How does that apply to the exercises we want to use? And then hopefully that we can pick exercises, which correspond. And so kind of in the classic model of direct correspondence, there's 5 criteria that are given. And those are kind of, one is, the kinematics of the movement broadly, so like that's, how the movement looks. That's not super focused on force. Ironically, the kinematics of the movement is normally where most coaches stop when they consider specificity. So they just think about, how does it move? How do they look when they're moving? And don't actually think about the forces that are causing those changes in movement. But anyway, that's the first criterion. The second criterion is, what joint angles are you in when you're expressing the peak forces? And so there's a nice contrast there. And again, in the example that we're looking at, so the triple jumper, when they're running on their track, their joint angles are pretty extended, when they're going to be expressing peak forces. Whereas I'd imagine, the lineman is going to be in deeper joint angles when they're expressing deep forces. So like where the force is being expressed is different in those skills. So that's the second criterion. The third criterion is looking at, what's the magnitude of the force? So kind of like, and I always feel like this is a sort of, like the king criterion. It should be above others because it's the criterion that gives you overload. So it's pointless, or, you're not going to get a huge amount of returns if you're choosing a training exercise which doesn't allow you to overload your athlete in some way. Like it doesn't have to be more force than, the exercise in the gym doesn't have to be more force necessarily than in the sporting environment, but certainly you need to be able to overload it in some way by doing more reps, or, there needs to be an ability to overload. So that's the third criterion. The fourth criterion is, the timing of the force production. So, what's the window that's available to you to express force? And how does the exercise correspond to that? So again, in the example you gave, it's, those are probably very different. Like, when the triple jumper's running on the track, they probably 0.1 of a second to express force, whereas, the first step from the line for the lineman, there's going to be much more time available to them. So that's the fourth criterion. And then the fifth criterion is, how is the musculature, like the musculoskeletal system, actually producing force? And again, that's, we probably saw a contrast there, so it could be, is it concentric, eccentric? Is the stretch shortening cycle involved? Is it just one effort, or is it a repeated effort? And again, we've probably got, a little bit of a contrast again here with the triple jump versus the lineman example, because, the lineman, when they're running on the track, is going to be very, very bouncy. Whereas, as I said, kind of the lineman is going to be much more concentric dominant, off the line. So kind of, I guess, sorry, like just to, so I'll shut up.
You go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, my fault. Like, so I guess, how you use those criteria is, it's not a hard science, but just in thinking about, is my training likely to get my athlete better at expressing force in the competitive environment? I just think through each of those criteria and think, does it where does it correspond? And then you can get some sort of sense, some sort of feeling for, whether your training regime is specific to the sporting demands in some sort of way. Again, that doesn't, every exercise doesn't have to be desperately specific. Like, you can have very general exercises in there because they're building a base. But equally, kind of, if you're thinking about, okay, how specific is this particular exercise to my sport? Like if it ticks a number of those criteria quite strongly, then it probably is pretty specific. If it doesn't, then, it's either very general or maybe it's not useful.
Guys, we're talking about high-end training concepts. We're talking about mechanics and research and all these things that are really, really overwhelming. You don't know what to do. But fortunately for you, we have a strength training app known as Peak Strength. Inside Peak Strength, we take all of these concepts, all of these exercises, all these thought processes, and put them into a well-executable program. Okay, it's going to be based off of your personalized setup. What kind of equipment do you have? How many days a week can you train? What type of sport are you training for? What are your goals? Okay, what's your training calendar? When do you need to peak? Peak Strength does it all specifically for you. It's the first link in the description. It's a pinned comment. Head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength, select your specific sport, or if you're a coach or a normal person listening to this, get into athletic fitness and start your journey to becoming a savage. Now, let's get back to listening to Dan Cleather. I think that's the one interesting concept. So it's like, when I look at dynamic correspondence, I think it is a way to have this filter or this lens to create some type of system off of and to have as like a checkpoint for the constraints of the sport. But then when I'm looking at it also, I look and I say, so I was coached by Anatoly Bondarchuk. And when I think about the kinematics of the movement, we did a lot of stuff that was like, so I was a shot putter and we would do half turns with a dumbbell and throw that or throw a rock or throw a concrete block. And the kinematics would very closely resemble that of a throw. But we got into the system later on and, where all of us were much more developed and we could probably all clean over 150 kilos, back squat over 230 kilos or so, bench press 210 kilos. And I think it's easy to get lost in the kinematics of the movement, looking and resembling this, but then ignoring the other stuff. I think it's almost like this natural wave. And it's interesting that as I've gotten older as a coach, I've actually gotten further away from that specific checkpoint of development of athletes, because I think the vast majority of gains can happen just by focusing on the other points in correspondence. And I don't know if that's something that maybe you have seen or not, especially in regards to force application amongst different types of athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that position. I think the most important thing about dynamic correspondence is it just brings attention to force. It's just an idea, like it's a system, but it's not a universal truth. Its main value lies in this idea of, okay, there's probably some relevance in the kinematics of movements. Of course there is, but it's very natural. Because we can see the movement, but we can't see the force, it's very, very easy to just stop at how the movement looks. Whereas, dynamic correspondence pushes you to think about, okay, well, but why? Why are they moving? Yeah. What's causing them to move like that? And then, it's very, very structured and rigid. And that might be helpful when you're starting out as a coach because it gives you a checklist, but kind of, I guess once you start thinking in terms of forces, you maybe don't need that checklist so much anymore. You're used to kind of appraising how an athlete is moving, not just in terms of, well, what are they doing, but the how of how they're achieving that. So as you kindly said, I could plug my new book as often as I want. Something, the analogy I use in that is, it's a bit like the Matrix, so once you start seeing the code that's behind it, then everything gets easy. But kind of, I think young coaches they can't see the code. They just see the movement. What you need to get to is being able to see, okay, but what lies behind that? What's causing the changes in that movement? So the value in dynamic correspondence is in giving you a tool to learn that, and giving you some framework for, doing that more formally. But once you're a more mature coach and you think in terms of forces, there's no way that I kind of, would formally sit down and go, okay, I've got this athlete here. I'm going to think through, all 5 of these criteria, to try and work out, whether I think this is good or not. Of course I don't.
It's, I guess the hardest part as a coach is like, okay, so I have this influence from Bunderchuck, from Dr. B, and it's like this like very specific transfer of training, and you've got transfer of training in the sense of like, he would say, you could throw a half pound or a 30-pound dumbbell or a 50, whatever, I guess it would be like a 10-kilo dumbbell, whatever, and you would throw it at 10 meters per second. Well, that 10 meters per second is much closer than 1 meter per second on the bench when you have a 13 to 15 meter per second shot put release or speed of release. And it made sense. And I carried this over into weightlifting. So I have a very big weightlifting background. And I'm actually thinking about this. I just got done coaching at the American Open, and one of my girls went 108, 132. And I had this influence from Bunderchuck of variations. So we do a lot. We still do a lot of variations. But as I've gotten developed as a coach now over the last 15 years, I've recognized that like variations matter, and they matter from a technical perspective, but it still comes back to like this overarching force application of what does she squat? If she squats 200 kilos versus 180 kilos, she's going to put out more force and her snatch is going to be better. And I feel like I just constantly have this weird, almost matrixy feeling where I'm like, it just comes back to this and this making the athlete have the structure to apply more force, and then the sporting realm will take care of itself. And there might only be like between 2 and 7 types of lifts that should be resembling like the actual variations, I guess is how I would call it. I don't know. I'm sort of rambling there, but one of the things that I was reading your book coming back home again, and I'm looking through my notes from like 2 or 3 years ago, because this one you released, I think, in 21. And I'm looking at it, and I had comments from 4 or 5 years ago that still ring true. And it was like, okay, I'm thinking about Anna, and I'm like, how can I get her to total 250 instead of 240? And I know where her back squat is right now, and I'm going, it still comes back to one thing. If she can apply more force in the same time, she will snatch more, and she's got to increase her back squat. But then I want to segue this into why should maybe, and I just wanted to tell you, like, I had like these aha moments reading your book again, and then I'm going, why do people worry so much about power instead of just simplifying it and worrying about impulse when they're trying to design their training and to design their impact on their athletes?
I mean, just, to pick up on, like the weightlifting example, and also what you did with Dr. B, like, I think I would guess, like in your training as an athlete, even though you threw all these sorts of, different weighted implements, like you still had accumulation and intensification phases. Like you were still squatting, yeah, you were still squatting, you were still, doing the Olympic lifts, and so it's, I believe like you do that, that you just have to keep bringing up the base, but then, but then you bring up the base, and then you have to translate that into the competitive environment. And then but the work that you do to translate it into the competitive environment is just sharpening the edge. Like it doesn't bring up anything else. So then you have to go back and build the base a bit more. And, so like if you're thinking about the weightlifter, it is, well, yeah, she just needs to squat more. But then you need to go and do some snatch, clean, and jerk, and then she'll do a better performance. But then if she wants to get better, she needs to squat more, and then you need to go and do some snatch, clean, and jerk. And that's training. Like you just, and I'm sure it was the same as, for you as a thrower, it was like, well, fuck, we need to do some squatting. Sorry. Like we need to do some squatting.
You're good.
Okay. I don't know what the, your audience is. But like, as a thrower, like you need to get stronger, but then you need to go and throw some stuff. But then you need to get a bit stronger, and it's the same thing, like, the thing that, probably, is misleading for people from the outside is that kind of the unusual exercises are the one that get the attention, so like it's kind of like, so like, like Bondarchuk's throwers, you'll see them throwing this, that, or the other, but if you think that they're not squatting as well, you're crazy. It's just, you don't see that footage.
They're not like a squat is not as hooky. It doesn't have as much eye attention, eye grabbing. I mean, unless the weight is insane. And I guess the interesting part with Dr. B's stuff is that we would throw lift, and then in the afternoon we would throw lift, and then the next day we'd throw lift. So we never really went that heavy, but every day you might snatch 100 kilos for 4 sets of 4, like 2 sets in the morning, 2 sets at night, every single day. So the accumulation of that, you weren't doing max strength work, but you were going, the load was insane. Now, and I've seen things that I disagree with now, as far as shot put and discus training is concerned, that I learned from him. And I'm not saying anything bad, because I think it was really was amazing. But I think with the weightlifting example, and maybe this also comes back to it, is it's like the timeline, the time to get good at it, and it's the skill to learn it, and it's there's other psychological aspects behind it as a coach as well. But it still comes back to, I don't want to talk as much about that, because I still want to get back into the impulse stuff and like trying to shed light on what impulse means for different athletes, or what it means in general, and how different athletes can apply it to become better at their sport, versus power, versus talking about power and talking about. And I did want you to define how you would define, I've heard you use the word power, and then you sort of like catch yourself, but then also how you define explosive, an explosive athlete, and then where that all falls under when we're talking about impulse.
Okay. I will get onto that topic, but just as, like an aside, kind of, like we stand on the shoulders of giants, as coaches, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with everything, that these amazing people, did before. Like I saw on Twitter kind of yesterday or something, someone who had posted like some replies that they'd got when they'd written to Verkhoshansky asking him questions, and he'd written back to them with like pages of notes. Like it was wonderful, and I was looking at them and, but, he still in there, he was like, the most important thing for a rugby player is their ability to express power. And as I'm going to argue now, like, I don't agree that that's correct, but that doesn't, invalidate, our field is built, on the contributions of this great man, but doesn't mean that everything that he said was right. It doesn't mean that everything he did in the training of athletes was right, or that it couldn't be improved. It's just, that, and it's appropriate to critically appraise, what they did. We just need to do so with some humility, and some understanding of the context in which, they were training people. To answer the question, you're entirely right that, like I will sometimes use the word power in a way that I'm unhappy with, and then catch myself. And the reason for that is that, like, power has a meaning to us as a word, but then it also has a mechanical meaning. And it's entirely natural and human that, we assume that the meaning that we use for that word when we use it in just general day-to-day conversation is going to be the same as the meaning for that word in mechanics. And it's not. Like, it's categorically not. And, the problem with that then is, like, it's fine if we're just using it as a word to describe something that we're seeing, and if we all understand what we mean by that, it's fine. But the problem is now that we're in an era where we measure this stuff. And, like, once you actually start to measure this stuff, like, the stuff that we're measuring isn't exactly what we think it is. And that's where we start to have problems. Like, power. So, like, to be, very, very technical, but, like, power is derived from kind of, well, first of all, you need to have this quantity of work done. Okay. So, or let me go back. Like, like, what's it going to be important to us if we're looking at how athletes change their movement is, the force they're expressing. Like, we've talked about that for half an hour, but you don't, like, if you just look at each instant in time, all you have is, okay, well, that athlete is, an instantaneous acceleration. Like, that's just a snapshot of what's happening. Like, if we actually want to see, okay, well, how, why did that offensive lineman accelerate, change their velocity from 0 to whatever it was, we need to sum up. We need to add up all of the force that they expressed, in the time period when their movement was changing. And there's two ways that we can do that. Like, we can sum up their force just by, taking it over the time period. So, okay, like, what's the sum total of the force that they expressed over the 1 second they were accelerating? And if we do that, that's called impulse. And that's quite intuitive, I think, to understand, even though the word is unusual. The other way to do it is that we could instead add up all the force that they produce over the certain distance that they move. Okay, so, like, okay, so in the 10 meters that they were running, how much force did they express? And that's called the work done. Okay. So, like, the impulse is a bit more intuitively easy to understand, I think, but okay, work done, fine. Like, you're just not thinking in terms of time, you're thinking in terms of the distance covered. How this relates to power then is power is the rate of change of doing work. Okay, so, like, it's an instantaneous measure. Like, at each point during that period where they were doing work, how quickly was the work they were doing changing? That's really not intuitive at all. Like, I think, like, it's, and I'm, pretty sure that's not kind of what people have in mind when they're using that word power. So kind of like, those are the definitions of those qualities. So now if we kind of like come back to what they mean, okay, well, impulse, like there's an absolute, one-to-one relationship between the amount of impulse you express and your change in velocity. So kind of like you're again, if we say that this lineman was accelerating for a second, like they started from 0 velocity, their velocity at the end of that 1 second will be exactly proportional to how much impulse they applied. Like that's the factor that determines what their movement looks like at the end. So it is the performance quality. Like it's the same, in a vertical jump. Like in a vertical jump, again, you start from zero velocity, and then how high you jump is determined by what your velocity is at the end. And again, absolutely, it's entirely, it's proportional. The velocity you have at the end when you take off is exactly proportional to how much impulse you expressed. Like that's more impulse, more change in velocity. That's what we're interested in most of the time. So that's kind of why impulse is so clear. If we come back to power, sorry, go ahead.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think so. I wanted to bring up Jeffrey Dyson's book from like 1962, and he says he's got this thing on impulse, and it's like the change in speed of an athlete or discus or a shot does not merely depend upon the force applied, but also upon the time which operates. That's impulse. The impulse of a force is equal to the momentum. Goes into, but like the first line to me is an exact. I don't know why, but for me, it like I have this highlighted and like, wow, that's really it's as simple as that. And then when you just described it with a vertical jump, it's like those are directly linked together. It's like it's and I don't know if this is accurate, but I look at impulse as like very clear snapshots in time. And it's like, this is what happened during this period, and this is what the impulse was. And that's, I don't know, it seems clear to me. Whereas when you describe power, like, it's like, okay, so if I'm thinking about an offensive lineman play and they're running, let's say they have to hit, they make contact and they push for 4 to 6 seconds. Like, I would rather train each little snapshot possibly than really think about what's their total power during that one play. I don't know if it like that. I don't know if I'm even making sense when I say this stuff, but it just seems clear. The impulse, the way you described impulse is much clearer, especially through the vertical jump lens.
Yeah, no, like I agree. Like, what we have is, the instantaneous, what's happening in that instant, like in that, has some correlation to what's going to happen. But, like that isn't what changes movement. Like you have a period of force expression, and it's during that period of force expression that the athlete, changes their velocity or changes the velocity of something. And so kind of like, if you want to understand how they managed to change that velocity, like you need to look at that window, like what happened in that full window. And that's what impulse gives you. Like impulse tells you exactly how much force did they express during that window of time. And we know that how much force they express during that window of time will be absolutely perfectly correlated with how they change the velocity of movement. So like, it is everything. And, like it's also kind of, it gives you, insight into things where, profound insight in things. So if you're taking the vertical jump example, like, all that's important if you want to jump high, like ignore the constraints of the sport, but like if you simply, want to touch the highest point, flag that you can on a vertex, then all that matters is how much impulse you produce. And impulse is, how much force over how much time. So actually kind of good jumpers, yes, they'll be able to get up to high forces, but you could have, like less skillful jumpers hit probably a higher peak, but they don't sustain it, and then it drops off. Better jumpers might not hit as high a peak, or they might hit a higher peak, but they'll get to the force level that they're going to get to quicker. Then they'll sustain it for longer, and that so that they rather than having a curve that's just a triangle, they'll have some sort of trapezoid like shaped thing, which gives you more impulse. So that's one thing, like so you can misanalyze someone's jumping, if you're just thinking about instantaneous moments in time, you might think, okay, well, they hit a higher peak for
exactly. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Like so
that's on page 15 of force.
But if you're just simply thinking about peak force and you got the peak force in a jump, you might go like, well, this athlete has a greater peak force, so it must be better. But if their peak force is this profile and someone who has a lower peak force has this profile, they'll jump higher. So that's one insight from it. Like the other insight from it is that actually, if you can stay on the ground for longer when you're jumping, then you have more time available to you to express force against the ground, and you'll jump higher, which is very counterintuitive for people. But skillful jumpers are able to keep themselves on the floor for longer. Like, the reason that we extend our limbs in the way that we do is to keep ourselves on the floor. People who are skillful at using their arms, that keeps you on the floor as well. So actually being on the floor for longer gives you more time to create impulse. Like you're expressing force over a longer time period, so you end up jumping higher. Like that's, I believe, why you see kind of people who do really well in the combine. They have these really, really flexed, hip flex positions when they jump. Like that's just, that's the technique that allows you to just, stay on the ground for a long time and jump high. Like that, you have to be realistic about that task, because that task, there's no one trying to hit you. You're not trying to get a shot off before someone. You're not trying to block someone's shot. In the sporting environment, sometimes it's not, you don't want to spend a long time on the floor. And so that's why people, you'll see people not jump. They'll jump in the combine in a different way to how they jump in the sporting environment, because in the sporting environment, actually, sometimes you want to get off the floor quicker. But, there are some sports, like if you look at volleyball, hitting is entirely predictable. There's no rush to get off the floor. Like, where the ball is going to be. You can take your sweet time, so volleyball players will jump, really, really flex, I believe, much more like you'd see in the combine, because they're in no hurry to get off the ground. They just want to get as high as they can, whereas, a basketball player, they have to get up, it's a disadvantage if they take time jumping. They will spend less time on the floor, and they'll be more upright when they jump, because, the demands of the sport, require that.
That actually does make a lot of sense there. And I like that example. We just posted a video of a girl learning how to use her arms when she jumps. And it's like, and I do think there is a lot of sports where you will see that. And that would be more of a hip. You would say that would be slightly more hip dominant if they're using much more arm swing on a jump, typically, especially from a standstill.
I think that there would be a correlation there. Okay. I think when you watch people who don't know how to jump, it's really, they kind of do something weird with their arm. Sometimes their arms are completely not coordinated, with what they're doing at all. But you can see that they kind of, they feel like they're throwing their arms up and their arms are going to drag them into the air somehow. Well, and there is, a component of that to the arms. But the more important thing is this, because this sticks you to the floor, so it's, again, I believe that the more profound reason why your arms are so important is in prolonging the time that you stay on the ground.
It's interesting. So we did a podcast with a world record holder with vertical jump, and he actually says this exactly, that when he's doing his, if he's out on the court, he likes to work on his speed, and this kid cleans, squats, everything. And he says he likes to think about he's running into the ground as hard as he can. And so he knows that when he's running faster, he can jump higher. And there's the image of Stephen Holm running really quick, or Anika McPherson. These are crazy high jumpers relative to their height. They have so much speed, and then they run into the ground, and you can see that's a little bit longer time on the ground, but because the speed is so, to the naked eye, you might not think it, but then when you actually analyze, it's like, oh, they're on the ground a little bit longer because of what you're sort of talking about. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Like, lots of things that we do when we move are trying to use stuff that's available to us to produce more force. Because if we're just producing force concentrically, we're limited in that. So if you think about a drop jump, like you see super high forces in a drop jump, but that's because, well, the landing, automatically, automatically provokes, a higher force, than you could get if you just start on your own. So kind of if you're dunking a basketball, like going in fast and hitting the ground really hard, if you're strong enough to be able to handle those forces, it is a way to use your momentum into the ground to have a higher rate of force development and to hit higher peak forces. So absolutely, that's the high jump example is similar but also different. High jump, you also want to hit the ground hard and block, because that is, blocking into the ground is a way of, building force quickly. But there, in a high jump, you also have the off leg, so you can swing the off leg, and the off leg allows you to kind of like transfer your horizontal momentum into vertical momentum. So there's kind of like two mechanisms there. But yeah, absolutely, I think kind of, one of the reasons why, strength training, can have a big effect on approach jumping is the stronger you are, the more you can tolerate slamming yourself into the ground, it's like you're using your approach like a drop, it's like a drop jump, and you're using that, that approach to just, use your momentum as a strategy to have higher rate of force development and hit higher peak forces than you can do if you're just standing and jump.
Right. Okay, I wanted to ask you, this is 100% selfish question here, is that when I'm writing out our training, so I believe in training, okay, there's essentially there's four characteristics of strength, or four characteristics in athletics, and I think it comes down to speed. And this is just physical quality, not related to technique. There would be speed, there'd be strength, there'd be explosiveness, and then there's endurance. Okay, so I like to take those four areas, and then I look at like 3 prongs under each area. And so I wanted to pitch you, and I want to see, and I want you to punch holes in it and say this is stupid, or at least maybe where you would alter it. Because if I look at like strength, and this is where I've been trying to think through since I've read your books, I've been thinking through, I want to be like this impulse crusader, as weird as that sounds. And I look at explosiveness, and I define it, and I go, okay, if I'm training an athlete and I believe that they lack explosiveness, okay, so how do I break this down? And I go, okay, I got impulse, and this is where I'm struggling. I have impulse. I use rate of force development, which I feel like is part of impulse, so it's sort of wrong, but this is where I'm looking for some help here. And then I look at it and I say, right now I'm talking through, and I say neuromuscular efficiency, but then I define that by like, if a kid doesn't max their back squat or anything like that, but their clean gets better, I look at it as they're maybe they have more efficiency. Like they haven't gained strength, but they've gained efficiency. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. If I see that their RFD is bad, in the sense of, I might test that through like a quarter squat, or coming off the pins of a quarter squat, and then I look at impulse, and I think about that through actually, I will measure that through a clean, and I don't know if that's right either, but I wanted to see, and maybe I should pitch you the strength components as well, but I wanted to see from the explosive aspect, like where do you see the holes being in something like that?
I don't think there's. I don't see a huge amount of holes in it. Like, you know, like I would, you know, like see that as you're labeling, you know, different parts of the force time curve. You know, and I, you know, like in my mind, it's similar, you know, so like, you know, you know, one thing I didn't say is impulse is the area underneath the force time curve. Yeah. So like, you know, more area underneath the force time curve, you know, equals better. Like, you know, like how can you make the area underneath the force time curve larger? Well, you can have a greater rate of force development. So like that means that, you know, kind of the angle of the force time curve, you know, if it's like this, you're slowly, you know, accumulating force. If it's like this, you'll get up, you know, there'll be more area underneath it. The second thing is, okay, well, how high does it go? And then the third thing is, how long? You know, and you know, in a lot of sporting environments, you're constrained in how long, but there are some where you're not, like jumping. But you know, so yeah, like I agree with you. Like I think when we talk about explosive power, and there's power again, you know, but like when we talk about, you know, an explosive ability, we're talking about rate of force development. You know, like that for me is that. Like, and that's, you know, like early, I'm going to, you know, make mistakes here, but kind of like that's you know, like your early rate of force development is very much a neural quality. Like, you know, like you know, which is how it feels as a coach as well, isn't it? Like, you know, like this is where the science kind of like supports the intuition. I'm not being very coherent now. Like, in super training, like that, you know, they label kind of the curve, and they have kind of like, you know, starting, you know, like they have the rate of force development, and they divide it into kind of like the early part of that climb and then the later part of that climb. And I think that that's a really clever and sensible definition. So you kind of like got, okay, well, you know, this, how quickly can you switch on, you know, like is really, really neural. Then like higher up on that, you know, still on the climb, you know, it's a bit more of a strengthy, you know, explosion-y type component, you know.
Okay, so this is where I'm struggling as a strength coach, because I look at that. Okay, I look at it. Okay, 400 milliseconds is like dropping under a clean. Even shorter than that would be ground contact on a sprint or a jump. Then a little bit longer than that might be, and I've called that like blast impulse in the past, and then for myself, and then I called the next one where it's a little bit longer would be like the pull of the clean, or the push of the guy coming off the line to make contact. So that might be like a half second to a second. It's a little bit longer. I just I needed to get that out because I think about it that way. And then I think about the lifts or the exercises that help, and then trying to designate where is this athlete struggling with their impulse? Is it on the RFD based off of that from super training, and then thinking through like, okay, these are the exercises or these are the lifts that this person sucks at, and if we increase this will get better. But I don't know if that's right or not.
Yeah, like it feels right to me. Like, you know, I think, you know, like, yeah, you've got, you know, strength is your ceiling of the force time curve, you know, and, you know, and moving up your ceiling has, you know, probably has benefits. But then, yeah, like I kind of, you know, for me, the way it feels is like, absolutely, when we're talking about someone being explosive or being powerful, we're talking about their RFD. Like, but I think that it's, you know, I would sort of view that and look at it like, okay, is it early RFD? In which case it's something, you know, probably a more twitchy component, or is it later RFD, you know, which seems to me to be kind of more kind of, you know, Olympic weightlifting-y type quality. But like you can see that in athletes. Like you can see an athlete who's super twitchy, so like they can start, but then it just like they don't pick up, or like they can't start, but then they pick up, but then they go, or you get an athlete who can start and then keeps accelerating. So, like, but yeah, that I think there's a huge amount of wisdom in that classification in super training of kind of like, okay, you don't just look at the RFD, as one quality from 0 to, the peak force. Like the first 50% and the second 50% are different qualities. Like for me, they're different strength qualities, and that's reflected, I think, in the scientific literature as well. And yeah, to me, there's something very profound in that we actually don't really think about. Like, it's not really talked about in the field. Like, we just talk about RFD, and we don't, and when people calculate RFD, they'll just, take the whole curve. I really do think there would be value in kind of like, okay, well, what's the first 50% and what's the second 50%?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of diagnostic value, I believe.
I think that's where what I try to do is if I'm measuring that, and what we do, because we don't have all the Hawking dynamic shit. We don't have tons of stuff that we use. Like, we have a VBT tracker that we might use, but I actually even would argue, when we're looking at peak velocity or average velocity, I'm thinking about how it actually means in regards to force, and that's what I'm using it for, more so than I am the time. But to go back to the RFD discussion, is I'm like, if I see somebody, if we do a hang, or if we do 2 boxes, or for a weightlifting movement, like a 2-box snatch or 2-box clean with my football guys, I'm looking at it like, if I have a kid who's really good with a 2-box clean, then that's late stage RFD that they're really good with. But then if they suck with double leg triple jump or single leg triple jump, then they struggle with early, and then we'll see that early corresponds to their sprints being slower. And then if then we can see their flying 10 increases if their single leg triple jump gets better, or we can see their starting 10 gets better if their 2-box gets better. And it's like, I think that's where we as strength coaches get so lost in. It's a simpler formula than we make it out to be, if we can tie exercises to those qualities. And I think that's what I'm and that's what I'm trying to do that's why I'm trying to pitch this to you.
Yeah, but I like it because, that's like coaching, that's, a coaching eye and coaching wisdom, and I think that gets lost a lot, in a culture of, measuring stuff, I mean, for me, how I would think, very, very simply, how you could see these different things in the weight room. And again, I've got the picture from super training in my head, actually, because I think there's a diagram of someone deadlifting a barbell that's next to it. But you can see if someone, if you watch someone take up the slack in a deadlift, when they go, does the bar, before the bar leaves the floor, does it instantly bend? Are they able to very, very quickly,
get it out?
Start. You can see, before the bar lifts, you can already see that they're bending the barbell. If they can do that from the word go, if you can see if they've laid down force, or conversely, does it take a while, before the barbell starts to bend? So just, I mean, obviously this is, talking about a pretty heavy deadlift. If you're, what happens before the weight leaves the floor, but you can see someone who like everything just goes on straight away, versus someone who doesn't go on straight away, but eventually they get there, and so like, I really do think that that's, like it's, something that you can, like if you have the coaching eye, like it's something that you can see, and I'm with you that like, getting an idea for, okay, is someone twitchy? Like, like for me, like that's what I would call, that's the first 50%. It's like, like, are they just all, raw nervous energy? Like, do they have that? And if they don't have that, like, what can we do to teach them that? Or, like these are kind of things that, like, yeah, we can use, measurement devices as a tool to try and see those, but also I think we should have some intuition for that as coaches as well.
Well, yeah, that's where it's like, if you're watching a deadlifter, it's like, okay, they got that early RFD, but, and this is, dude, I argue this bullshit all the time where I'm like, if I get a kid, let's say a weight, like my throwers, we don't really deadlift, but if we're doing like 1 box cleans, dude, you get them on a deadlift once they get the slack out of the bar, and they can just, once the slack, so the slack would be the early RFD to me, at least in my opinion. The second, once it comes off the ground and they turn it on, that's like late stage RFD, and that's where I see something like a clean coming into play and taking over for the lift. Is like, okay, and if they fall forward, they lack that because they're not doing enough loaded work from a shorter range of motion, which then decreases their time when they have that. So that's where I see, and I don't know if that makes sense, is like if I put people on a box or 2 boxes, it's decreasing the amount of time that they can apply force. So they have to have higher RFD, at least later stage RFD. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, like I'm now firmly feeling like I've lost the mechanics and I'm just talking as a coach. Like, but which isn't to say that they're not consistent, but like, like it feels right to me. Like
is this what you're talking about on this page on super training?
The camera has just blurred. Yeah, I think that's exactly the one on the right.
Okay, that's on page 107, 108. Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Like I mean, like if you're talking about weightlifting, like I think, I don't rag on CrossFit. Like I think CrossFit is, has been, a wonderful gift to weightlifting as a sport. Like, like how can having many more people participating in a sport not be a good thing? Like, however, like, one of the things that I think you see a lot in CrossFit athletes when they weightlift that's missing is the violence of the acceleration in the second pull. Yeah. Like, like there's something in how they train that, like, maybe it's doing the reps, like, where this, like when you go, you fucking go, like just doesn't seem to be there, for them. And, like to me, that's, and again, I'm kind of rambling a bit now, but to me, that ability to just violently go when you go in the second pull is the interesting quality in weightlifting. Like it's that, that's what explosive means to me. It's that, and that, like if you think about this mechanically, when you're weightlifting, like and when the barbell's past your knee, like you're not starting from zero force. Clearly, like there's some force expression already there. You're holding a barbell, you've already primed the nervous system. So for me, that's the kind of, that later stage RFD, the second 50%. So kind of you have like twitchy stuff is the first 50%, you know, like, and then, yeah, the second 50% is the violence, you know, that you see, you know, in someone who is a good weightlifter.
Right. That just turns it on. And I think that was a question I had for you too, is like, and maybe this is just more of a trade-off for athletes, is like you're trading one thing over the other, is that I think through, and you say this in force where of like simplifying things. And I've tended, I worked with Norik Vardanian, so I had an impact, like a learning impact from him with technique. So I was very privileged in that sense. But from arguing this, jumping your feet versus not jumping your feet in weightlifting, and in my mind, I think if you're grounded longer and you're almost doing a no feet movement, or if you think about like Lu Xiaojun or Yuri Vardanian or Norik Vardanian, these guys, I mean, even Olivia Reeves right now, she doesn't really jump her feet super high. She sort of just slides them out. Do you think that has any impact on impulse, or is it more of a trade-off? Like people who jump their feet are more inclined to do this, and they might express force better if they jump their feet. Like, do you have any thought on that as a technical aspect?
Like, not specifically on kind of jumping the feet. I haven't thought about it enough to kind of opine on that, but like, you know, there's where, you know, the cues that we give to athletes, you know, aren't necessarily things that we want them to do. We're just things they're things that we say to them that make them do the things that we want to do. You know, so like, you know, like an example of that, you know, sticks out for me. I don't think it's a great weightlifting cue, actually. I don't like it, but you know, the cue shag the barbell, like, you know, thrust your hips into the barbell, like, you know, some coaches, you know, like they actually want to see, you know, people contacting the barbell. Like, that's not what the cue is for. Like, you know, like, you know, driving your hips into the barbell, in my eyes, is technically incorrect, because you're going to hit the barbell and push it away from you. Like, you know, so the cue isn't given because what we want to see is them hitting the barbell against their hips. The cue is given because it allows you to understand that you need to be extending your hips forcefully. And so kind of like, if that cue is used well, you know, like you're not giving it because you're trying to see them, you know, like shagging the barbell. You're giving it to them because you're trying to encourage them to extend their hips hard. You know, so like, to me, it seems like, you know, like if you're telling someone to jump their feet, like, or if someone's being cued to jump their feet, like, you know, the reason for that cue isn't about kind of the end point. It's what it does to their force production earlier in the movement. You know, and you know, kind of like, you know, towards the end of the movement, like in vertical jumping and weightlifting, like there's too much emphasis, I think, on what happens at the end. You know, so like at the end of the second pull. And the reason that emphasis is there is because it's much easier to see that. You know, so again, when people are starting out coaching, like they can see the end position at the end of the second pull. You know, they're not as able to, you know, because that's slow, you know, like, you know, it's harder to see things that are happening earlier. But what happens at the end of the movement isn't because of, it is the result of things that happened earlier in the movement.
Right.
You know, so like, you know, and again, like in bad kind of CrossFit weightlifting coaching, you know, you'll see people, you know, really, really strongly emphasizing people to shrug hard. But that kind of makes them stall at the end of the second pull. like you don't want, at the end of the second pull, like you've already done the work, like you've produced the force, like you don't want to be waiting there. Like the shrug that you see, your shoulders ending up in this position, it happens because of what your intent earlier. It's not, that you're emphasizing that at the end. Where telling someone to shrug hard is a good cue is if it, is if the intent is there to move hard fast and you exert force when your shoulders are down. And then it can be a great cue. But if you're using that cue and really trying to get someone so they're here, then you're going to stop them dropping underneath the bar, and two, you're going to make them be trying to exert force in a position where they shouldn't be exerting force. Like that's already gone. Like you should have exerted that force earlier.
Yeah.
And it seems to me kind of like, like the jumping feet thing is probably like, like if someone's being cued very strongly to jump, like that's the pattern that you're giving them in weightlifting, then I can see that there might be a tendency to move your feet more. Like, and that's how I view weightlifting as well. But if it's someone who, much more sees it as a pull or as a lever, and is using cues that are based around that maybe their feet wouldn't, leave the floor as much. But I've never really thought about the degree of the feet moving. Like I'm kind of spitballing off the top of my head.
I've always just thought about like if even with my football guys, I'll say, look, if I can put a longer ground contact time into the ground, and then we just go like this. Now, not only should I be able to pull longer, which increases impulse because I'm increasing the time, ideally, I'm assuming. And then when you slide and catch, you would be grounded sooner. And then you're going to be receiving the bar likely in a better position. And I think that's where, when I think about manipulating force and understanding force in training for athletes, that's like a way that I think we could take impulse and like genuinely try to apply it. But I don't know if that's 100% accurate or not.
Like, my kind of like digression there was just trying to kind of understand why, you see big variations in technique in good weightlifters, don't you? Like, why people might be doing things that you think are non-optimal. Because I'm with you, like, on this question of like, I agree. My idea of what the best technique would be is, like you finish the pull and then you move your feet quickly to the position they need to be to receive the bar, like going up and out. Like, I don't see it that as being because you lose an opportunity to create force, because again, kind of like most of the force has been exerted earlier. It's more about kind of like, well, if you jump up in the air, well, you've got less time to get into a good stable position to receive the barbell. So kind of, I absolutely, agree with you kind of, I think, with your idea of what would be the more ideal, technique there. Like, I'm just kind of trying to speculate on how people arrive at things. Like, the thing that's, I do think, that there's lots of debates in weightlifting technique, and some of those are, people can clearly, be elite, doing different things. I do believe that, there's sort of more, on some questions, some things are more mechanically optimal than others. But also just, if you're really fucking strong, like, you get away with shit, I need to think about that.
That was one thing I wanted to bring up before and I know this is going long, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but one thing I was going to bring up is like, you look at, okay, I want to take a little bit of your time on the VBT discussion, because I talked with this guy, the head strength coach at Tulane, football guy. He's now at Florida. Big into weightlifting, big into jumps, good speed work, sound like dude, sound very sound. And he talked to me, and he's like, "Yo, do some stuff with your weightlifters." And he was explaining, even with my throwers, move a bar at 0.7 meters per second, move a bar at 0.5, move a bar at 1 meter per second, and then figure out like playing around with this. And it had nothing to do with anything I had ever read about with VBT, like the classic things that you would do for loading. It was more like, okay, yes, intent, the athlete is now having a game to like try and push these things faster, which I do think helps with coordination and rate of force development. And his whole thing was, if you get an athlete that can squat a heavier load at like 0.7 meters per second, they will do a better job with their force expression. I'm trying to think how he pitched it. Like basically he was like, they will use more of their tank that's left from a big back squat. Like they will know how to use it better in a shorter time frame. And I know it's a little ambiguous. It doesn't really make sense, but I wanted to see if you have ever seen this, and I almost wanted to relate the peak velocity discussion. I think when they're under these, when they're trying to beat this machine right at 0.7 meters per second or whatever, I think the athlete is able to apply force, like they try to apply force earlier and longer. And I think that's the benefit you see from that type of training. And I don't know if you've encountered this at all.
Like, I think I absolutely agree, with your last statement. So kind of like, if you think about, okay, like back squatting under a certain load, okay, like, and what velocity you're back squatting it at, you're if you're going to like, so the problem, the problem with velocity-based training is it's a kinematic measure. Yeah. Like, and so we're not measuring force, and, we need to be very, very careful in interpreting things, because, we're not looking at the force. However, it is the impulse that you're creating that's causing the change in velocity. So yeah, if someone is, hitting a higher velocity in their back squat, they've created more impulse. They've expressed more impulse. And yeah, they've probably done that early in the movement. Because, like if you're squatting, it's not ballistic. So like you've only got, you've got a fixed distance to move, and you need to slow down, so like, I mean, the weight will help you slow down, of course, but kind of like, like it, yeah, if you're able to move faster, like you've probably, you've created more impulse at the start, and maybe, you keep kind of, like you have more sustained impulse, because that's what's going to, or more sustained force expression, because the total impulse that you have is what's going to lead to a higher force. So like, yeah, I do, I have sympathy for the position that, yeah, like, if someone's able to squat the same weight at a faster velocity, that probably that means that they've expressed more impulse, and that probably means that they expressed that impulse earlier in the movement, and those sorts of things seem like they'd be valuable, to me as well. My only critical comment on those is like, like giving an athlete that on the screen, like, is a great, target and goal for them to go for. But again, as a coach, I can see if they're grinding that squat out, or whether they can, squat it super fast,
That's fair.
But there's certainly there's certainly a quality there. Like, there's certainly athletes that, okay, when they're going to fail, or when they're doing a near maximal squat, it's going to be super, super grindy and slow, and other athletes that they're doing a near maximal squat and they still move really fast, and I definitely prefer to have the latter athlete, and using a velocity-based training device is certainly going to assess that.
What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. I actually think that even goes into still where I make this argument is like, if I have an athlete who, okay, so let's say the athlete that's super twitchy and they're moving at like 0.5 meters per second on a squat, and then next thing you know, they're at 0.3 and they're fucking dying, right? Like, that's an athlete that fails that I see that is the twitchy athlete. They're probably fast on, in running. They probably are bouncy when they jump, but they lack the late stage RFD. So to me, if they are and so we had a kid like this. He goes into high school next. He's a junior this year in high school, and he's run a sub 1 second flying 10. But sometimes he comes out of his start and he falls over. He'll clean 120 kilos for a triple, but sometimes he'll catch 110 kilos and he falls over. And he's so twitchy, and I relate this, and I think this is the value of looking at it, explosiveness through those three areas, and then I look at the RFD the way that you had depicted, like, okay, early and later based off of Verkhoshansky. I see in this case this kid Faith lacks later stage RFD, which is why he fails. He might do one rep at 0.5 meters per second, and then his next rep he fails because he gets out of position slightly when he's fatigued, and then he has no ability to hold that later stage. I don't know if that makes sense, but I believe that that's an example of what you might see with someone who is overly twitchy. And then on the same regard, you might have someone who lacks that early stage RFD based off the Verkhoshansky model of the graph. And they're the athlete that they move 70% of their squat at 0.45 meters per second. They move 80% at 0.45 meters per second. They move 90% at 0.4 meters per second. And there's barely ever any drop off or any increase. And I don't know, like, that's just like something that I see that I think, even though it's still trying to pitch it through this lens of impulse, really, is what I'm trying to do with that. I don't know. That's me blabbing. Sorry.
Like it feels the same way for me. Like, I just as an aside, like I use the word feel now quite a lot because I don't have the, we're not, for me, like we're, like it's hard to put precise mechanical language to this. Like, this is the art of coaching, like, or certainly I don't have the skills to put precise mechanical language to it, but that's, and again, like going back to what we were talking about before, this is where, like you kind of like, these, the mature, the intuition of coaches, like these are discussions that are informed by mechanics, with it, it's based on force expression, but it's very hard to be very clinical or analytical about it. But yeah, like, for me, like that's, like super twitchy athletes are super exciting, like, like it's like, fuck, this guy is good. But they still need to train, and, like, I think, like you get super twitchy athletes who, often will have no max strength qualities, or sometimes will have no max strength qualities, so you can give them that. But then, also in giving them that, or, the other quality that you want to work on is, okay, they can twitch, but like, where's the pickup? So it's kind of like, often for me, the raw material that's exciting is someone who's super twitchy, but like they're not a champion until they've done some training,
Right. Okay. So one final question here is, what would you use to replace the word powerful? Would you replace it with impulsive?
I don't think impulse is the same, because you can do things like you can get lots of impulse by expressing force for longer, so that's
true.
That's skill. Like, for me, it's when we talk about someone being powerful, we're talking about them having great rate of force development. Like, like I don't know how you put that into an adjective. Like, maybe there's an opportunity there, for a coach to coin a new adjective and build a system around it, and make lots of money selling the
sell it on Instagram.
But yeah, like for me, that's the misnomer. When we say power, what we often mean is high RFD, and we don't actually mean mechanical power, and maybe one way to resolve that is just to recognize, talk about mechanical power, so you could then say someone's powerful, but that's RFD, but it's not mechanical power, it's messy. It's hard. It's because our language, has a colloquial use, which doesn't align with the mechanics. So it's completely it's completely natural to make those mistakes.
Yep, that's it right there. So Dan, tell everybody where they can get your new book, because in my opinion, the new book would then be how to impact athletes from a training system, but then also factor in the psychological aspects and to get them to produce force as effectively as possible in their sport. Where can they pick it up?
Thank you. Yeah, it's on Amazon. So kind of like if you search my name, the new book's called The Practice of Change. So you can you pick it up there. We were talking about what's the thesis of, the thesis of the book. I mean, it kind of weaves together a couple of my earlier books, like the Black Book and also the biomechanics one. But I guess the kind of the main angle there is just to recognize that our bodies want to change. Our bodies are very, very willing, to change in response to the things that we do. And, sometimes, we don't have the patience, to kind of, respect that it's really our body that knows how to change. We're just, asking respectful questions of it. And then we need to give them, the body time to make those adjustments, because we don't know how to build muscle fibers or rewire our nervous system. We need to let our body take care of that.
Yeah, I even hearing that, it's like let your body have time to make that change and have an understanding of the time horizon. I even thought about this with weightlifting stuff. It's like we know it takes a decade plus to be a really good athlete. So why are we not doing a snatch or a clean in our training for athletes? Because we know it's going to take 10 years, so they might as well freaking learn it. And the athlete, your body is willing to make that change based off the adaptations. It's just it's very hard for us to consciously comprehend or be aware of how those physiological changes occur. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of something when you were just describing that popped into my head.
No, like I agree, and like patience and consistency, are or consistency is the main tool, of change of being good at things. Like I just, I kind of, feel like a lot as, when we train, we feel like we're in charge, and we're not.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a partnership, it's a partnership between, we ask our body, a question, and then our body responds, and like if you kind of, frame training in that way, like I think like it helps you get into a much more sustainable, consistent pattern of, of long-term growth, whereas kind of when you're trying to dictate, to your body, that's when you kind of break, get bored, get frustrated, do silly things, all of which, stall your long-term growth as an athlete.
100%. All right, Dan, thanks for being on. Everybody, get Dan's new book. Head over to Amazon, pick that up today, and all of his other books as well, because they're absolutely loaded with content. I appreciate you coming on today's podcast. Peace.
Thank you so much for the invite. Thank you.